Mega Man Issue 48. Mega Man stands on the Rush Jet, who flies around while Wily threatens him with Gamma. And there's nothing but predictable dialogue. Until something creative happens, I don't see the point of the story. Wily says all of humanity would benefit from his leadership, but of course he doesn't explain how they would to try to convince him he'd do a good job, which is typical of characters with his goal in fiction, but he just accused him of being naive. I always had to assume he thought most people wouldn't believe him if he explained how he was going to improve the world, because he already carried out such a scary show of force, so he sees it as pointless. A flashback has Dr. Light say that Wily wouldn't have had time to give Gamma weapons, and puts his hand on Mega Man's shoulders. He told him to find a weak spot in it, so we see him shoot Gamma and fail to damage it. He uses the Time Stopper power, and is he able to see inside of it? How? Just because he's a robot doesn't mean it makes sense to constantly have him use Deus Ex Machinas like Mike Gallagher did with Sonic. You have to have Dr. Light have had a reason to give him that upgrade first. He runs out of ammo on it, and when Mega Man says Gamma could bring the castle down on both of them, Wily explains that he's safe inside Gamma anyways. How did he not know that? Mega Man uses Rush to spring him above the fist so that he could run up its arm. Rush pushes him out of the way and gets grabbed. Mega Man sends bombs at Gamma, climbs up to below its chin, and it moves, getting him to fall on its fist and get grabbed. I like that because it's a comic book, it's probably able to tell a more interesting story than the fight with Gamma in the game, where you were probably always able to jump around. Gamma wasn't holding Mega Man tightly enough, all because Wily is stupid enough to not just have the fist hold him as tight as possible to instantly crush him, and went too far in the other direction by mistake. If he'd rather boast at him right before dealing what he'd know is a killing blow, he already boasted at him when he grabbed him with the fist, and by that point he could have crushed Mega Man before he'd get a chance to say he'll beat him to the punch. So him launching a fist below him is enough to spring him out of it, and he gets close to Gamma's head and uses the search snakes against the energy elements in its mouth. There's an explosion there for some reason, just because it lost its batteries. It'd make more sense if he threw a bomb to cause that. Obviously, I don't see why the absence of electricity would cause an energy-related thing to happen. The mecha falls over, Wily gets sent out of it, and we eventually see a rock fall towards him, and we don't actually see it impact him because of the smoke and maybe camera angle, while in the game, we did see the rock land on him. Either way, I assume a trapdoor saved him, but that'd be incredibly lucky that he happened to be sitting on the one part of the floor that was the trapdoor. And this just reminds me of Issue 50, with what Bell maybe saw happen to Starline. Not that we got to see it, because screw letting us see slapstick for villains. Proto Man sees Mega Man, and the story cuts ahead to Dr. Light instead of bothering to show him warp him to safety like in the game. This scene failed if even the game was better. I'd rather see how Wily survived right away. Otto warns Dr. Light that there could be embers in the lab remains, and he thanks him, and calls Roll dear and tells her not to worry, and says he can afford to rebuild, even if it'll delay all of his projects. Roll hugs him, and he puts his arm around her, saying that he can replace their original photos and home movies with new ones. Too bad he didn't make backups in a place other than the lab, despite being a genius. He could have sent backups to Noelle. He reassures her, showing her affection, and Rush's barking gets them reunited with him and Mega Man. Dr. Light hugs him, gets apologized to for the destruction of Gamma and told what happened, and remembers Wily shaking his hand and hugs him, reassuring him. Otto calls Mega Man buddy and reattaches something and gets thanked for it as Roll hugs him, and Mega Man apologizes. Proto Man plays his whistle near them, and they hear it before he warps away. The story ends near a damaged Wily fortress where someone says someone's stable and merely injured and is going to be evacuated shortly, because it got saved by Deus Ex Machina purely because he's in the next game. And there's a ridiculous looking character who doesn't look like she belongs in the Mega Man series. Why are her shoulders just big orbs? Why is she blocking one of her eyes? And what are the chances of us seeing a second redhead like a Gerudo? Surprisingly, she's from a Mega Man game too. But I never would have guessed with that design. There's no indication anybody knew who'd support him was anywhere near him. So the idea that any army of people on his side would go save him when he didn't explain what he'd do to improve the world if he ruled it just seems too convenient to keep me immersed. It's interesting to reinterpret Mr. X as a different character from Wily himself when everybody said he was just Wily in an obvious paper-thin disguise. She says Mr. X has big plans for Wily. I hate it when text boxes spoil an event in the next issue instead of us getting shown what they're saying in the story itself because it ran out of comic space for it. Mega Man issue 49. A robot wakes up with his weapons disabled and applies updates to his system before waking up to Mega Man. And somehow he tries to punch him right away when common sense would dictate that said updates would involve making him unable to want to hurt Mega Man. Nate Morgan reprogrammed a Silver Sonic to be good. Why on earth would Dr. Light not reprogram him out of wanting to kill Mega Man? When he promised Mega Man he'd do it for the Robot Masters, and Mega Man constantly told them that he'd do that for him as if he approved of it. This just reminded me of IDW Sonic. And even in that, at least Metal Sonic was chained to the wall when he woke up. As if it wasn't bad enough that it made IDW look unoriginal before, because Wily also had rubble from a mecha fight fall near him and make people think he died. Somehow, Quickman is surprised by and needs to be told that his weapon systems were disabled, even though there was text on the second panel saying weapon system disabled, with disabled in red text to draw attention, and it was obviously supposed to be from his point of view. You'd think he'd remember that. Mega Man says his weapons were disabled in case Wily's programming wasn't fully purged. How would it not be fully purged yet? He would have gone through all of his programming before waking him up. Who would be that stupid? Mega Man goes out of character to taunt Quickman for no reason. This would make more sense for Cutman. Woodman tells Quickman to calm down. So why is he good now and not him? It turns out all of the second series robots are harmless now, which has to mean they were reprogrammed. And somehow, Quickman's dumb enough to ask how they could have possibly all been restored, when it's obvious immediately how it could happen. Mega Man apologizes for the damage to them, and Quickman refers to Wily's robots as the bad guys and Mega Man as a hero, which would only make sense if it was because Dr. Light reprogrammed him to think like that. Or he wouldn't fight for Wily. And he doesn't complain about the fact that he'd only say that because he was reprogrammed. And it has to be because the reprogramming keeps them from having a problem with it. I say that, but he doesn't look happy about it. So that's confusing. Mega Man explains that he still has his armor because it's better to be safe than sorry around them, when for all he knows, they weren't really disarmed. It would have been smart of Sonic to have the sense to wear armor around Metal Sonic when he reactivated him in IDW. Mega Man gets asked what happened to Wily and fortunately explains that he was too damaged to move, so there's no reason he should be gotten mad at for what happened to him. Then Stern tells Madame Y to move it because she's in front of the latest Wily castle, which he explains is on an island owned by the X Corporation, and they're taking inventory of the castle. I just realized, how does it make sense that Mega Man X was called X by Dr. Light when he would have only associated the name X with the evil Mr. X? Stern threatens to punch her, making me wonder if his partners are the only reason he didn't lose his job, and Rosie tells him to take it down a notch. Madame Y thanks her and wants to steal the Robot Masters, and Rosie makes up an excuse and walks away from her with Stern. She tells the robot driver to take her back home. Stern admits that he shouldn't have lost his temper and thanks her, and she says she owes him an apology for thinking he was just being paranoid, when clearly there's a private military there covering up for Wily. This scene really didn't have a point to it though. Wily wakes up and gets greeted by Mr. X and compliments him. Mr. X tells him he works for him now and orders him to follow him on crutches or else. And it turns out he has a cyborg eye. Mr. X of course wants to make Wily try to take over the world. Mr. X says that in his youth, he thought he could stop the robotic menace by fighting it, but he's seen the future and realized that humanity embraces the synthetic way of life and it leads to wars. So he's Xander? He looks nothing like him. What are the chances Xander would look like Wily when he got older? This would be acceptable if it was explained that Wily and Xander were related all along. He says he needs Wily to continue his work because he'll shock the world into action that way. So he's just hoping it'll happen if he lets him do what he wants enough times. Because he's desperate. Because clearly the last couple of times didn't shock the world into action, and he's barely gonna do anything different the next times. It doesn't make sense that Bubble Man still thinks he's loyal to Wily. I mean, he's clearly reprogrammed because he didn't try to kill Mega Man. Rule tells me he could be an ecosystem manager, and because it'd be a respected position, he jumps at the chance to do it. It sure is convenient that the law lets people hire robot masters when they've got no college degrees or resumes. Airman says he could be a forecaster, and Flashman plans to join the Kronos Institute, because he thinks he's better than someone who can only slow down time. Dr. Light finally clarifies that even in the comic canon he had a hand in designing the 8 of them, when before it looked like Wily was fully responsible for them. And I'd prefer that, because not only would it be different from the games, giving the comic more of a point, but it'd make the fact that they're going to be useful all the more special. There's no reason Snake Man would still be creepy and not care about startling Dr. Light after he got reprogrammed by him. Which he obviously is, or he would be fighting Mega Man. How do you screw this up? Mega Man says happily that they can all move on with their lives. And somehow, Quickman's able to say no and says he was built to destroy, even though the fact that he's not trying to kill Mega Man proves that Dr. Light reprogrammed him. And he'd have to be an idiot to have not reprogrammed him. Not to mention the fact that if Dr. Light just erased his memories of working for Wily, then he definitely wouldn't be saying this. And if only he was smart enough to have an amnesia ray, then he could solve this problem instantly. This is such forced conflict. Just get to the part where the conflict's justified. He's too prideful to like the idea of becoming a mailman. Out of nowhere, Mega Man says that once he's reprogrammed, he won't mind. And that reveals that Quickman wasn't reprogrammed yet. What? But he clearly said earlier in the issue, his weapons were disabled just in case Wily's programming wasn't fully purged. So obviously some of it was purged. He is reprogrammed. Why in the world was he purposely reactivated without getting reprogrammed first? How could the heroes be that reckless? If they were that stupid, they wouldn't have lived this long. They would have done something like try to kill Doc Robot when he was threatening Roll. So the dumbest moment in IDW Sonic is even worse because it wasn't even original. It was a sign of the writer proving he can't learn from his mistakes. Quickman says that if he gets reprogrammed, Dr. Light will be getting rid of him, and he'd rather just be blown up again. Sure is convenient that Time and Oil Man didn't say that to Mega Man. They were all reprogrammed perfectly fine with no issue whatsoever. It's almost like they should have done the same thing to these guys that they did to Time and Oil Man. Why are they even giving them a choice? Of course they're not going to choose to be helpful. Crashman says this is a good idea for some of them, but his function is to blow stuff up. And somehow he doesn't realize or get told that he could be helpful in demolitions, in a comic with Bomb Man in it. So instead it's forced drama straight out of a soap opera purely because it's a work of fiction. Heatman says he appreciates the sentiment, and another robot says that since he's built for battle, becoming a lumberjack doesn't have appeal, even though they're all reprogrammed. So obviously they would find it appealing. Obviously they must have been reprogrammed or else they'd all be trying to fight Mega Man. They were completely incapable of being reasoned with before. Gemini says he's too experimental to be useful, and Magnet Man says some of them are too specialized. Rather than simply telling them that they could get a normal person job, and they don't necessarily have to get a job that goes with their theming, since there's literally robots that drive cars for federal agents. Dr. Light explains to them while being drawn to look uncharacteristically evil that if they can't serve a practical purpose, they must be decommissioned. And somehow, Quickman likes the idea of going offline, even though every robot would be programmed with a self-preservation instinct, or else they wouldn't try hard enough in a fight for Wily. That's supposed to be the third law of robotics. A robot must protect himself unless it conflicts with the first or second law. This comic pays lip service to the rule of robotics about robots not harming humans. Why in the world would Dr. Light care so little about the lives of robots, to intentionally program robots to not give a shit about whether they're gonna be killed or not, and want to die? Shadowman says he'll stick around, and Quickman gives him a thumbs up. Quickman's just reminding me of Surge here, and makes him look even more stupid as he says that to not be the real Quickman would be the real waste and he'd rather die, even though Dr. Light told him that he was the one who made his blueprints, meaning that he was always intended for a different purpose than Wily gave him, and yet he somehow thinks the real one is the later version of him, despite being blatantly told otherwise. This is why it would be common sense to reprogram them while they're offline. Dr. Light turns Quickman offline and lets Mega Man hug him as he and Roll look sad. And I wonder why the hell the writer was allowed to put this in a children's comic. It's like there was no quality control from Capcom at all. This is blatantly unnecessary. When it should be obvious, if they were reprogrammed by Dr. Light, they wouldn't be able to say they'd rather be shut down than be useful. I know that in a later Mega Man game, there's a Robot Master Museum and Wily robs it, but I feel like surely there has to be a better way to justify Robot Masters turning up in a museum. It would make more sense if Dr. Light never got a hold of them in the first place, and so they were recovered by people that had nothing to do with Mega Man's family. The government could say, we found him on government property, therefore it's our property. Because that's what the government says when people find gold coins on public property. The story ends with Sigma taking Wily away from a portal behind him. That was a waste of a page. We didn't need to see this. This issue is about Mega Man defeating Gamma with the Surge Snake stealing its batteries, which somehow makes it explode when a crash bomb would have been better for explaining that. Mega Man did stuff like spring on the mecha's fist and run up its arm and climb up its chest to its chin using the metal blade, which tries to make the story interesting and worth it, because that couldn't have happened in the game. Along with him launching out of its fist with a hard knuckle somehow because Wily was too stupid to have him held tight enough to be crushed right away, or at least after he said last time, so the idiot's ball forced him to lose, which never makes for an entertaining victory no matter who the character is. Wily gets hit by falling rubble only for it to turn out he was only injured and got rescued by the minions of Mr. X out of nowhere for some reason. It feels like a Deus Ex Machina with a story ending there. If Mr. X was so smart, why didn't he make a clone of himself instead of using Wily, or hire someone to do that? Wily can make a hologram of himself to transmit his voice from. Wouldn't Mr. X hire someone to do that instead? Can't he make a robot who could do the same things for him as Wily without the risk of him betraying him? Or threaten Dr. Cossack into it? This issue is a complete mess, where somehow Quickman and the others were reactivated without being reprogrammed to want to be good and useful first. The story's so poorly written, it even forgets whether he was reprogrammed or not, because one panel Mega Man says that he doesn't know if Wily's programming was fully purged from him or not, and the next he says once you're reprogrammed you'll be fine with it. As if it wasn't forced enough that Quickman woke up without being restrained then. Somehow these robots were able to choose to let Dr. Light shut them down, despite getting reprogrammed by him to want to be useful. Sure, it's inconvenient that a supposed genius was too stupid to think of how they could be useful, and all the time he'd have to think about it. This is just forced soap opera drama that's clearly out of place and unnecessary in a kid's series. And when I say soap opera, it's quite literal. Soap operas are known for giving the characters idiot balls for the drama. It's the most embarrassing writing of conflict. It's called the idiot's plot, and it's a bad writing trope. Basically, this was issue 12 of IDW Sonic's beginning, but somehow worse and stretched out to most of the issue. The only worthwhile part of the issue was Mr. X revealing that he's either an elderly Xander or confusing because he miraculously has the same backstory and ideology, and that's why he wants Wily to keep being dangerous. He could have just made a Wily robot instead of saving the real him when he'd know he doesn't deserve it. Either he can't make robots, explaining why he doesn't do the same thing Wily did without him, or this is forced too. He could have hired someone else to make a Wily robot. Or he could have forced someone to do what Wily did.